Show your support for the Untold Radio Network family of shows and join in on the conversation by using super stickers and super chats on YouTube. Got a question you want answered? Ask it live via a super chat and get real-time responses from our show's knowledgeable hosts and guests. Help keep the Untold Radio Network shows running strong. We need your support. Send your super chats and stickers now.
Good evening, everybody. Tonight, Jason and I are looking at the classic British TV mockumentary Alternative 3 from filmmakers David Ambrose and Christopher Miles. Now, this film dates back to the mid-1970s when it was broadcast on British television, and it was shortly followed by a companion book of the same title by author Leslie Watkins. Now, Alternative 3 weaves a fictional conspiracy theory involving disappearing and murdered scientists, approaching climate disaster, and a secret space program come breakaway civilization that just might be mankind's only hope, or at least the only hope of the elite group that plan to escape environmental Armageddon by fleeing to off-world colonies. Now, is Alternative 3 based on any kind of reality, though? I mean, I think both Jason and I are probably going to agree that the film isn't true, but is there some undercurrents there? Did the authors and filmmakers inadvertently stumble onto some greater, more notorious and nefarious conspiracies that they were unaware of when they were spinning their fictional yarn? Well, we'll address those questions and more tonight on Mysterious Library.
Sorry, I was looking up one last little tidbit for today's show, because there's one thing we need to absolutely lay out, which is no, this is fake. Like, this video this is full of actors. This is not some real broadcast that was somehow suppressed. I want to double check one thing because I knew it was, and I'll let y'all know what that is here in a second. But first, Dean, how you doing?
I'm doing good, mate. I'm looking forward to talking about Alternative 3 with you tonight. I remember when I first discovered it back in my 20s, and I read the book before I saw the film because I discovered it in that kind of pre-internet era when you couldn't just find a streaming version of some long-lost film or buy a pirate copy on eBay or the like. It was like you'd read about Alternative 3 in various UFO and conspiracy lore books, which took it somewhat seriously, and then the book itself was available, but it wasn't literally, I don't think, until eBay. Not till eBay, till YouTube, and there was a copy on there back in the day, which was the first time I got to see it. I think. I don't think I ever got to see it before then. I certainly read the book first, anyway.
Yeah, I had heard of Alternative 3, but I'd never seen it before now. I really wasn't 100% on it. I was aware of it. Like I said, it's one of those things you're aware of, but you said you hear it as it's this hidden secret thing that was broadcast once in the 70s, and they pulled it down. So That is not what this is. And the one thing I wanted to triple check before we came on here is because I knew it, because I'm a dork, but just double check. There is a man they claim is a famous Apollo astronaut in this film, and his name is Bob Groden. That is not a man who was ever an Apollo astronaut. I know, because I went back and I'm like, well, you know what? Maybe
Just in case Groden was real, I better
right,
check.
just in case. Like, hold on, it's like, you know what? Because someone's gonna say, well, just you can't possibly remember every Apollo astronaut off the top of your head, and you're 100% correct. I can't remember the names I'm terrible with names, so I just double checked, and no, there is no Bob Groden anywhere. Was not one of the people who landed on the moon and walked around. He was not a
It was
part of the Apollo program.
Neil Skywalker, wasn't that him?
Yeah, Neil
Neil
Skywalker. That was
Moonwalker, Neil
him. Yeah.
Skywalker.
Mhm. I think that's who clearly Bob Groden's based on. So yeah, guys, this is the video it was science fiction. That's what it was manufactured as. I just want to make sure this is because someone's gonna get no. It really was a real broadcast that was put out, but they yanked it down because they didn't. I'm number one about they over here. I'm telling you, this thing's not that, but that's not really the point of this show.
We'll talk about we'll hit a
Yeah.
few different things. We will hit Groden and his significance and his
Yes.
perhaps the
Mhm.
way he fits into the mythology of astronauts
Yeah.
who are changed
Mhm.
after their exposure to something in outer space. So it feels real because of that. We hear
Oh,
these
absolutely.
stories about. But before we go in that rabbit hole, I might just very quickly do a fresh off the presses that I
Please
have
do.
this week. I've got to see some advanced chapters or some advanced sections of this. I just ordered the hardcover on Amazon myself as it became available just in the last week. And that
Ooh.
is Chris Orbeck's book, brand new book, Sources, Tracing the Origins of Disc-Shaped UFOs. Chris Orbeck has written a number of important books in
Mhm.
this field before, including books with Jacques Vallée. And Orbeck has discovered that flying saucers was a term used long before Arnold's
Really?
sighting. So
Ooh.
in many ways, I suspect this book, for those who are going to pay attention to it, and perhaps
Mhm.
people like you and I who are interested in the social psychological aspects of the
Yeah.
UFO phenomenon, are going
Mhm.
to find it quite paradigm changing. Whether that will sink into the broader UFO
Mhm.
community or not is another question. But I think for folks like us, I think it's going to be a real wow moment when we read this book.
All right, looking forward to it. Looking forward to it because that you know what? Because I will argue that absolutely changes. I would suggest that that would actually even show a heavier hand, and I think changes a lot of the nuance. If it's true that the term flying saucer does not originate from from Kenneth Arnold's sighting, then I think that's almost prima facie evidence that that the heavy hand of interference has been much heavier than we even have speculated on the show, because that would appear to be a very deliberate, hey, we're going to pin this phrase on this one dude in order to make what he saw, which again we've talked about ad nauseum. Hold on, I've got because we still have the images up here. Again, like we've talked about pretty much ad nauseum, he throws up this drawing, and I'm sorry, as an artist, that's what he saw, straight 100%. This is what he saw flying. But if they automatically change that to flying saucer, then that feels, as an analogy to UFO, then I think that right there, you're right, that is paradigm changing, because that shows without a doubt that they were manipulating it from the get-go.
Yeah, I think Orbeck has done some research in places nobody even thought to look at before. And as an historian, from what I read, I was like seriously impressed. I was like, "How on earth did you find this
Mhm.
stuff? How did you dig this up?" But he's obviously a very thorough scholar, so I can't wait to get my copy. I think mine arrives sometime this week. I'll be diving into it as soon
Yeah.
as it gets here.
Oh, I'm excited. I'm sorry. I just gotta show this one last time. Okay, I'm done. I'm sorry. This is one of my like these are some of my favorite planes. Like, I'm sorry, these are just awesome designs. But like this, I'm sorry. That is. Did you ever read Calvin and Hobbes growing up?
You know what? A little bit, but funnily enough, I spent
Mhm.
a few months living in Chagrin Falls in Cleveland, Ohio, which is where
Really?
what's where
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
set. It's set in Chagrin. It
Yeah,
doesn't
yeah.
say Chagrin Falls, but it is Chagrin
That's where it
Falls.
is,
So
yeah.
yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, no, anyway, one of the it's sort of like a character within the character Spaceman Spiff when, Calvin Klein, he's, doing the traditional sort of, Flash Gordon stuff. For some reason, the Avro car always reminded me of his spaceship. That's it. Anyway,
Well, it's
all right.
related, funnily enough, to what we're going to talk about tonight,
It
or
is.
where I'm going to take us,
Mhm,
because also in these old photos from I think our Roswell episode, What Really
mhm.
Happened at Roswell, we've still got pictures of the Project Paperclip boys there. The
Yeah.
Nazi scientists brought into the US essentially illegally after World War II to work
Mhm.
on various scientific, namely
Yep.
weapons projects, but there's also a long history of their
Mhm.
involvement and perhaps some would say almost creation of the CIA. But
Yeah.
that becomes part of this
Mhm.
story further on as well, which we
Yeah, it
which we
does.
will get to.
Mhm. Yeah.
So anyway,
Um,
tell me your first thoughts, because this is the first time I know that you've seen. So you went down to the library, you asked you
yeah.
went down to the viewing area, and I guess you
Mhm.
asked them to put on the movie
Yeah.
for you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The gnomes were nice enough to put reel to reel on there, because that's how they roll. The popcorn wasn't ready, but that's fine. It was earlier in the day, so I opted for some nachos. Um, it and a hot dog. Yeah, the hot dogs are really good. You don't think that they're going to be that good, but they are. It's something. It's somehow I don't know what the gnomes are doing, but they're really good. Um, Yeah, so okay, I wanna talk about again, because this is what I do, I like to talk about the aesthetics. This legitimately feels like, because I mean, it does come out in the '70s, right? So it's very easy for them to get that technology and make so it wasn't like today where they're trying to recreate. It comes out in the '70s, so it's very easy for them to do what they do, right? But this really does feel like it's a 1970s production, um, sort of, infotainment science channel thing, science report thing. It gives it that feel. It does have that degree of legitimacy to it. And it's presented that way. I love the fact that you have that thing in again on the YouTube version that you can get. They have that center between like the part 1 and part 2 where you get all the
That's because somebody pirated it from a
yeah.
channel where it got
Oh,
sent into.
exactly. Yeah. No, that's why I love that
Somebody
even
got the
more.
original copy and just ripped it. That's probably the only
Yeah.
reason we can even see the thing today,
Oh,
I
yo,
imagine.
oh, I know. Like, which is I loved it. It's like that. I loved that part of it. But so the aesthetics are brilliant, and really you don't get the feeling of it being anything other than what it is until you really get to the section at the end with Mars, right? There's a few points where it's like, okay, the fact that it's British television, you start to feel the lack of the budget for the special effects, which they do a pretty good job of working around. But other than that, the aesthetics are great. It feels like a legitimate sort of news story, right? Um, it was
Well, there's a great
yeah.
background, of course, to that. It was you're indeed correct. It was presented as if it was a part of a series called Science
Mhm,
Report. Now, as far as I know, I believe Science Report never existed. Often people who write about this say they put it on Science Report and made it look like it was one of their episodes. No, they invented a whole fake show called Science Report, and then they presented it on
mhm,
TV like this was part of Science Report. But much like Orson Welles' broadcast of War of the Worlds on the radio in
mhm,
1938, if you just tuned in, you thought you were watching a show called Science Report, and it seemed very much, you're right, like those kind of news magazine, science magazine, TV
mhm,
productions of the '70s. It was presented the way a show would have been at its time, and so while we kind of make mock of people who still think it's a real movie, at the time, it was so
mhm,
convincing then to the audience that there were thousands of people
yeah.
who were terrified because, as we'll get
Mhm,
to, the predictions of the movie are pretty dire. And apparently, the station got like something like 10,000 callers from people
mhm,
just taking it, as a real show
Yeah.
and being quite disturbed. So in many ways, it was Britain's version at a milder level
Yeah.
than
Mhm.
America's 1938, War of the Worlds. This was, when was this? I think 1976
Yeah.
1977. I correct
Oh,
myself. It was
77? Yeah.
20th of June 1977, and of course the great irony, and this is why it kind of
Yeah.
why it maybe tricks so people, is it was, as the final frame of it shows, that's the final frame of even what went out on June. As you can see,
Yeah.
it says Science Report, Anglia Television, Norwich, England, April 1st, 1977.
Yeah. It was
It was
supposed to be
meant to go out.
broadcast.
Yeah, it was meant to be an
Mhm.
April 1st gag, but there was some kind of they were difficult to coordinate a slot on April 1st, so it got pushed
No,
back
it was
till
it was a
June.
it was a there was some sort of a strike with the workers at so they had to push it back because there was it was some sort of a strike. And so it didn't get broadcast for, until June. So it's removed from that April 1st context, right? So yeah, it was yeah.
So in other words, they made it
Mhm.
to fool people. It was designed not just to look real. It was designed literally to be an April Fool's trick. Like, haha,
Yeah.
like you were
Mhm.
meant to see that frame at the end. By then, most people are probably screaming at their neighbors, the global elites have, this
Yep.
whatever plan, right? And they're
Mhm.
panicked and they're not actually waiting to watch the final frame
Yes.
where April 1st comes up.
Well, and I think the other thing is they because stuff like this is a really influential episode. Like this thing in the realm of science fiction is very, very influential because a lot of people have looked at this and said, this is a great idea. And they've sort of done and played with this idea. In the 90s here in the US, they did a sort of version of this, but as War of the Worlds, but it was a live broadcast, right? So it was supposed to be like a live uh sort of news report, and they even had like real anchors come on, but it was done in such a way that you could never mistake it for being a real news report, right? That's it, and so you could tell where it's like they've taken the idea, but they've also said we want to make certain people understand that these are clearly actors clearly doing
Mm-hmm.
fake things.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was hammed up, and but yeah, it like this is like I said, I've heard about this thing since I was a teenager, because it is from the science fiction realm, because it's always been very, very influential. I've just never had a chance to see it, but yeah, like they go all out on this. It really does feel legit.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've removed that from the April 1st kind of thing and you don't know what's happening, I could see sitting down watching my television in 1976, though I was in Texas, but and not alive, and saying, "Oh wow, what is happening?" Because it feels like a real thing. Like they did a solid job on that.
Yeah, and don't forget too that what it's kind of plumbing into are genuine fears of the time. So it starts with them saying, we
Mhm.
first discovered this story when Science Report was covering
Mhm.
the brain drain, which was a real thing in the UK. British
Yes,
scientists and
absolutely.
academics and other creative types, and they were leaving the UK, usually to go to the United States, where there was bigger
Mhm.
pay and better facilities. This was a
Right.
real thing, and it was capturing headlines in the UK frequently. So they started with that. So anybody watching goes, "Oh, I've heard about the brain drain. This is interesting. Let's see
Yeah.
this." And
Mhm.
then they use that disappearance of scientists and academics and spin it into they're not just kind of going to another corporation in America. They actually vanish. They're meant to be going to America and nobody ever hears from them again. So then the mystery starts. Like, what's this about? And then they spin into another concern of the time, and that is the idea of the population bomb, the idea of
Mhm.
an expansive population, and the idea of some kind of environmental or ecological collapse because of so many people. So it starts to talk about greenhouse gases and all the dangers that are coming to hit the planet. So we've got the brain drain. We've got the brain drain's actually missing people who just disappear off the face of the earth. And then we've got
Yeah.
the earth might be legitimately going to be destroyed. And then they spin in
Mhm.
it to with this astronaut you were talking about, who's supposedly part of this space program, which
Mhm.
is when he's a normal astronaut, but he's discovered when he's been to the moon that there's things already there. There's this, in other words, we learned by the end, there's been a long-standing secret breakaway space program, which has even been to Mars. Back in
Yeah.
the 60s, it got to Mars. We see footage of them going to Mars, which
Mhm.
isn't that bad for the day. I mean, I think the Mars footage is pretty convincing for
Oh yeah,
something
no, the
from
Mars, no, the footage
1977.
on Mars, yeah, the footage where they're like in what appears to be some sort of helicopter, or
Oh,
it's like a
yeah, they're meant to be
yeah,
going along the surface, and then they
mhm,
land, and something's crawling in the dirt. But anyway, so
yeah,
it sets
that
up,
was solid.
so then it sets up with these real concerns of the day: brain drain and environmental cataclysm, and also the fact that we'd only recently got photos from Mars. In fact, that's the way the two creators of the show, David Ambrose and Christopher
Mhm,
Miles, first thought about making the show. One of them, they were having a coffee, and one of them, I think,
yeah,
was doing a documentary piece on the brain drain.
mhm,
And then at the same time, there was this release of photos of the first Mars mission or something,
yeah,
right? I mean, the unmanned mission, whatever the first, satellite type photos we got back, or whatever the devil they were called.
yeah,
Um, and then they went, wouldn't it, imagine if we could tie these things together? And so they got this science fiction kind of trope of, this
mhm,
idea of a secret space program, and the world's in peril, and there's this, mission to get the
yep,
elites off the planet. And I think and I think those things all just hit a raw nerve. It's the same way War of the Worlds hit a raw nerve when we're on the
yes,
cusp of World War II,
yes,
the idea of
mhm,
invasion from the skies. This thing, it pushed certain social buttons of the time. The British fearful that they're losing all their best scientists,
mhm,
the general global fear of, ecological disaster and overpopulation problems, and spin
yeah,
that with advances in space travel, and boom, you've got this thing that just would just trigger the zeitgeist.
yeah. Well, okay, and quick little thing there. You realize the catastrophic event that was supposed to be caused because of man-made pollutants and all that was going to be a they literally say another ice age.
That was the big fear back then,
Yep, because
before the
that
narrative
was the big
changed.
fear was, and of course they list a bunch of disasters that did not occur. Like there was a few things that kind of happened, but they
Yeah,
list things that didn't really actually occur.
that's a good point. I
Um,
think there'd been a drought recently
mhm.
as well globally, so
Yeah,
they
there had been.
tied that in as well, but I think you're right, some of the other things were played up more.
Yeah,
So that
like
was another thing that people saw and
mhm.
thought, "Yeah, that's right, there was a drought." So it was ticking all these
Right.
I put
And
them all
there
together,
had
and
been a
all of a
volcano
sudden
that had, popped up in Mexico around that same time, so but they really ramped a lot of that up, so it's like there was just enough there where, again, if you were moving from that, April 1st thing, it would be very easy to buy this story. Now, again, once they do the photograph, like, yes, when they're actually on Mars, it looks great, but what I mean is the photographs of Mars where supposedly, um where the Russians and Americans had dropped nuclear weapons on the poles to soup to vaporize the moisture to put water in the air, so there were clouds and what looks like vegetation like that. Those photographs were, I mean,
well,
literally like
I
cotton
see what you
balls
mean.
stuck on, yeah, like
Gotcha.
that's where you're like, okay guys, I see it, but it's
But
other than
incidentally,
that,
that was the technology back then too. Like
it
we're
was,
so
yeah.
used to Hubble telescope pics now. Like astronomical pictures of astronomical bodies weren't always as beautiful
Mhm,
as we're used to seeing. Speaking of astronomy and astronomers, here's Horace Smith, and he asked, "Did Close
mhm.
Encounters of the Third Kind come out at about the same time?" Yes, it came out in '77 as well. So
Oh yeah, so that
that's an interesting point.
good point, yeah, yeah, but
Interesting point, Horace.
so yeah, okay, so aside from the fact this is clearly, a science fiction story, and the aesthetics are really, really good. Like you said, there is a really interesting pressure point that's touched that would make you really give this idea pause of the governments around the world creating a breakaway civilization because they fear that life on Earth is going to become so difficult that we kind of have to just wait it out and then come back once it's stabilized, was sort of the idea, to make certain that humanity survives. Um, and there were a couple of really interesting points that were made that, even sort of, if you take that step back, you're like, that's not an unconvincing argument, right? So back to this, what was his name? Bob Groden. Yeah. So the thing around the Bob Groden astronaut is that he's supposed to have been an Apollo astronaut who goes to the moon. Apparently there is this freak out moment that is listened to by everyone, and everyone's supposed to have heard this thing, right? Another one of those things that lets you know, okay, this is fake. of him going the wrong direction, essentially, and NASA's telling him turn around, right, kind of a thing. But he sees something and they shut down the channel and they're using code words, right? And then of course he comes back and just a few years later, he's freaked out, he's flipped out, he's, looking all messed up. And so the theory, what they're showing is that they land on the wrong part of the moon, and he goes and he sees essentially what is the
dark
breakaway.
side of the moon, really, which is like, so he's on the other side. So yeah, the breakaway civilization, right?
Yeah, and so he's seeing this platform, and the thing that they use to sell this is, and he says, "Do you really think they need all of that technology down in Houston to send a couple of guys on a bicycle to the moon? Do you really think that's what they need?" And it's kind of an interesting point. And they mentioned, like, we've had over 1,000, like, by this point. Again, whether that number is real or not is irrelevant at this point. But, they said, look at all this that we've sent up into space. All of these rockets that have been sent up by the Russians, by us. Do you really think that's all they were doing? Right. And then there's the line of, yes, there's the Cold War. The Cold War is going on, but we've been really cooperative in space. It's like the Russians, the Americans seem to get along really, really well in space. And that seems a little odd. Right. And there's the political scientist who's like, it's like, yeah, you could chalk a lot of this up to mutually assured destruction and everything. But, a lot of us have been kind of puzzled because we just have the public facing stuff. And a lot of this doesn't match up. What's happening versus what's being said and what the political pressures are. So there's a couple of really decent arguments saying, that they sort of present of why are they being so cooperative in this one field? This one, these are supposed to be mortal enemies, but they're shaking hands and going out for drinks about space. We have this both countries are spending inordinate amounts of money on space, and they're sending a lot of stuff up, but that doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense considering what's public facing on it. And so they make this, it's sort of an easy argument saying maybe because what we're seeing, that the NASA that we see, the Apollo program, all that is essentially the public facing side as the masquerade for what's really going on. And that's where Mr. Bob Groden comes in, is that he's the astronaut who realized that they're just a dog and pony show to cover for the fact that everyone's going to die, and the governments of the world are trying to get people out, and that they're just the mirage.
Yeah, and I think it's a great story, and we have Jamie from or JCats here is Asper60 from Down South Anomalies. You should check out his show also on the Untold Radio Network with his wonderful wife, Aspersia. He writes, fake astronaut Bob was resonating Buzz Aldrin behavior post-Apollo, which Leslie Watkins used later in the novel adaptation. Now, the novel adaptation, which was released, I think, because of the success or the interest in the documentary by Leslie Watkins, obviously has more space to develop the conspiracy theory. So we learn the novel, which is what I read first. It has some moments also which are fairly convincing. So we learn, which we don't learn in the film, what alternatives 1 and alternatives 2 were. So in the novel, alternative 1 was to detonate atomic bombs up somewhere in the ozone layer to let all the pollutants of the planet out. That was one of the things they talked about doing. Ironically, the US military actually did really high nuclear testing back in the 50s or 60s, so almost tick that as a fact. The second alternative was we have to go underground. When it gets really bad here, we'll live underground, much like the ancient Titans and Atlans did in the Shaver mystery. But of course, where that ticks the real boxes is America has hundreds of underground military and governmental bases. I mean, there's Mount Weather, there's ones under Camp David, there's ones all around the place. So we really do have, and some of those, ironically, are actually to serve in the event of some type of cataclysm. Normally, it's considered it's going to be a nuclear war or something, so we can still have operating government underground.
Mhm.
But we do have those capabilities, so you can actually tick
Oh,
2.
yeah.
Alternative 1's kind of been done, although it might have been to release the pollutants, but high altitude,
Yeah.
nuclear blasting.
Mhm.
Alternative 2 has definitely been done. So it's kind of
Yeah.
interesting when you start to look at the book. It's able to flesh it out. It's the conspiracy's far friendlier in the movie, like, because it doesn't go in the details. In
Mhm.
the movie, we know these scientists are disappearing and supposedly being taken off-world, so are other academics and other, high-end individuals
Mhm.
to create this off-world civilization. But
Yeah.
of course, any civilization is going to need its worker bees as well. So the book has like abductions. The book
Oh,
implies that
really?
people are being turned into sexless slaves and modified so they can work on the Martian and moon surface. Like, it's pretty hideous.
Oh, wow.
It also talks about things like cattle mutilation. Like, just in
Mhm.
passing, we'll have all those dead ponies found over there. That was a result of a batch assignment that failed. And batch assignments in the book are when they take people or when they take animals, because they're all considered cattle. So it
Mhm.
starts to spin into the darker realms of conspiracy law,
Oh, wow.
about human experimentation, about, turning the general population into slaves. So it gets scarier and scarier. In fact, I have a little passage from which I should read, because it might make people want to go and hunt
Oh, yeah, yeah.
it out. It's from Jim Keith, who's now passed under very mysterious circumstances, when he was one of
Oh,
America's
really?
leading conspiracy researchers, and he died at Burning Man. He fell off the stage, hurt his leg a little bit, went to get some minor surgery, and died on the operating table. So America's greatest conspiracy theorist dies in
Oh,
um,
yeah, that's
mysterious circumstances.
odd.
Anyway, Jim Keith wrote, among several books, and one of his great books is Casebook on Alternative 3. In fact, this edition is called Mind Control and UFOs, Casebook on Alternative 3. I think it was first just called Casebook on Alternative 3. But he quotes Mae Brussel. Mae Brussel was one of the leading conspiracy researchers in America in the 70s and 80s. She had her own radio program. Playboy interviewed her. She was well known to be one of the top JFK
Mhm.
assassination researchers. Like, she cross-referenced every volume of the Warren
Mhm.
Commission with newspaper stories and witness reports. This was a hardcore conspiracy
Yeah.
researcher who was very well respected at conspiracy law at the time. She wasn't a UFO person, she was just a
Mhm.
conspiracy researcher. And this is what she said on one of her radio shows on June 22, 1979. Now, the thing about Alternative 3 is that I've received many manuscripts and books from listeners throughout the years, but I can't remember in 15 years ever having a reaction. This book made me nauseous, and I wanted to vomit, and I wanted to faint. I wanted to cry. I wanted to bang the walls down. I literally had the shakes for about a week. It was so scary, because it just could be the bottom line of these conspiracies. I believe it probably is the most important book I've read in many, many years. I don't have any doubt in my mind that this is a very dangerous document to have. Probably the most dangerous thing which I possess in my library at this point. And the only thing that will relieve the danger is to share it and disseminate the information. It's the one book that puts into focus all the books and articles which I have received for the last 15 years. And interestingly, I'll just say what Keith says along a similar line. He says there's only one problem, because he just totally dismisses it as well initially, right? And he says, well, perfectly secure in my knowledge that the TV show and the book are basically yellow journalism using scare tactics to make a pound. I'm a little shocked to realize that, at most levels anyway, the revelations of Alternative 3 are true. So he's maybe America's top
Yeah.
conspiracy researcher of the 70s and 80s, America's top
Mhm.
conspiracy researcher of like the 90s, early 2000s, whenever he passed. And they're both saying this is real, not necessarily that the
Mhm.
book's real or the narrative's real, but all this nefarious stuff coincided with all the research they were doing.
Yeah.
So that alone is worth looking at the Alternative 3 narrative. Now, you can dismiss Mae Brussel. Now, I'm being the person wearing the
Yeah.
tinfoil hat instead of the skeptic that I usually am. And you can dismiss Jim Keith, but I find it
Mhm.
fascinating that arguably two of America's most significant conspiracy researchers ever
Mhm.
looked at Alternative 3 as somehow
Being real.
if the film itself's fake and the book itself's fake, it's touching things that
Mhm.
seem to be real. And that's fascinating.
Yeah. Aspa had a couple really interesting comments here. Apparent. Oh,
So
sorry.
sorry.
Yeah.
Oops, you go.
The first one was in the late 90s. ASPA interviewed Leslie Watkins when he had relocated to
Wow.
New Zealand. Yeah, I was like, oh, that's interesting. He first fled to Australia because of the blowback from his book. That's interesting.
Fascinating.
And then points out that Jim Garrison loved May, but she appears to have lost the plot overall over Alternative 3. Horace, I want to come back to your comment here in a second, because it's a great comment. I do want to bring that up a little bit later, but I think the point here that you're making, I think it does tie together, is it would be very, like I said, there's a really, like I said, the argument that's put forward has a lot of convincing sort of little touchstones where you're like, yeah, maybe there is. And I think the problem is it's a little too easy to see the world government saying, oh, we're all, the planet's about to go through this really bad thing. Let's create this other thing out here. Let's just save ourselves and the people we think are special. And let's use all your money to do it and leave the rest of you here to die and suffer. And then we'll just make certain once it's gone back to being cool or being normal, we'll come back, and whatever civilization's left here you all will probably survive in some form, but we'll just take y'all back over. You can be the worker bees, is essentially what the implication of this is.
And interestingly, in Jim Keith's book, he has a whole chapter almost talking about that worker bee thing, how secret societies and various totalitarian governments and various philosophers have long dreamt of a society where there are just a small elite at the top and everybody else operates like a bee, or operates like a drone bee anyway, or an ant in the nest, while the queens sit at the top. Just before we move on quickly, because Jay Katz brought up interviewing Leslie Watson, I had an interesting letter I pulled from him as well that I thought it'd be worth reading, because he's obviously the person who did so much more to draw out the narrative in the novel. And he says that which is fascinating. He says he knows it's all fiction. He made it up, right? And so he says it's fictional. But he says he was asked to write a sequel, and then unfortunately, a chest containing the bulk of my letters was among the items which were mysteriously lost in transit some 4 years ago when I moved from London, England, to Sydney, Australia, before I moved on to settle in New Zealand, which is what Jay just said. For some time after Alternative 3 was originally published, I have reason to suppose that my home telephone was being tapped, and my contacts who were experienced in such matters were convinced that certain intelligence agencies considered that I probably knew too much. So summing up, the book is fiction based on fact, but I now feel that I inadvertently got very close to a secret truth.
And here's the thing that makes me really kind of, I mean, we're almost 40 minutes in. We're kind of getting to, I think, what the real conversation is going to be. Here's the thing. I would have no doubt that may be the case, and here's why. We've literally seen this happen before. I can't believe I just got his name. He wrote The Hunt for Red October.
Tom Clancy.
Tom Clancy, thank you. After he released Hunt for Red October, he got a visit from the DOD, because they literally sat him down and they said, you need to explain to us how this thing exists. Essentially saying, we know the caterpillar drive is real. You've explained it way too perfectly. They were ready to have him drawn up on sedition charges and charge him with releasing this information out into the world, because it was essentially real. So we've had, and the reason he was able to, he essentially didn't go to jail, was he pulled out all of the articles. He's like, this is the stuff I just got from, this is all public article stuff. I just put it all together and figured this would be a thing. So it's not that the Hunt for Red October itself was real, but there was enough about the Red October itself, its caterpillar drive, all of that was real enough from the stuff that he'd gotten, that the government went to him and said, we got to, like, they were going to draw, they were, and he was able to prove that he didn't have some sort of secret inside mole. So the idea that, he comes out with this and weird stuff starts happening because maybe he got a little too close, I'd buy it. I'm sorry. It's like, we've seen it. We've literally seen this happen with what's an obvious, fictional novel. And what was it? Coast to Coast AM, the caller who calls in,
Mm-hmm.
who's an actor. Like, he's like, this was just a performance art deal. It's all I was doing. But during the broadcast, when he's talking about how the government's going to kill everyone and he works for them and all, the transmitter is shut off.
And fascinatingly, the
Mhm.
documentary or the mockumentary Alternative 3 has the exact same moment when the British guy
Yes.
is talking via satellite connection
And it
to
shuts off.
the American astronaut. He's,
Mhm.
he's getting mad over being asked some question, and then it gets the transmission gets killed, and you think, this is what happened to Art Bell, like, 30
Exactly.
years later,
Yeah, exactly. It was like,
20 years later,
that
whatever it was.
feels a little too familiar. And again, I hate to say this. I don't want to be, I always try to say, go touch grass, right? Stay grounded in reality. You can't just let your mind spin, because once you de-entangle yourself from some aspect of reality, it's really easy to go down just la. But me, Rob, and a particular guest, we were backstage. We weren't even broadcasting. And we start getting into some of the details of his experience downrange, with the company and all that. And while he's talking about this story, his internet flakes out. And I'm like, okay, it had been a little sketchy earlier anyway. So I pull up my phone. My phone has rebooted, and so has Rob's phone. We finally get a hold of him. And he's like, yeah, it's like my internet blinked out, and my phone rebooted all at the same time. So all three of our phones rebooted at the same time. His internet goes down. Well, and we're not even on air. We're just backstage talking. So yeah, you tell me that this guy comes out with this, and he seems to find a little unusual intention. I'm not surprised at all. And yes, that's a little more than worrying.
Jay added something to that as well. Given that he's actually spoken to Leslie, we probably
Mhm.
should add it. He said that he said it was originally from his imagination, but after it was published, he discovered his phone tapped, which I mentioned in that letter
Mhm.
that I found from Leslie online. And he also started to receive letters from high-ranking officials. But I think this is where Jim Keith, and it's really worth reading. Anybody who's interested in Alternative
Mhm.
3, reading the case book as well is fantastic. I forgot I had it on my shelf. I used to have it. I forgot I rebought it. And I actually looked today. I wonder if I got that book. Oh, I've got it again. So I pulled it out. But what Keith does such a wonderful job at doing is saying, well, look at all the nastiness that goes on at these high levels. Look at Project Paperclip or
Yep.
Operation Paperclip. It's Project, isn't it? Whatever. And the involvement of the Nazis with the US space program, the involvement with the Nazis with the CIA. And he just goes through these things like the eugenics program, the
Yeah.
idea that he looks at ruling elite, like literal quotes
Mhm.
about them, fearful of there being too many people. And he goes through all of these things which are on the borderline of conspiracy. And he starts to paint this picture of a world where there's a ruling elite that really don't like the masses, and they probably do have plans if things go south to do something about it. He's like, why is Alternative 3 such a crazy idea? I mean, maybe not the mission to Mars or who, as he says, who the
Right. Yeah.
devil knows, but the fact that there are already underground bases for government and high ranking officials to survive
Mhm.
a nuclear attack. I mean, so many of the things that seem ludicrous to somebody who wants to think the world runs, very honestly and openly. But the reality is, I don't think you have to be a conspiracy theorist today to recognize. We're probably far more aware than somebody watching a British TV show in the mid-1970s
Yeah.
that there are roundtable groups, which he talks about as well.
Yeah.
There are economic forums. There's a council on foreign relations. There's all these groups that operate behind the scenes of the political process that have very firm and clear intentions of the way they'd like to shape social policy and
Mhm.
the way they like for populations to move and the way they'd like things to do. And if you think that in fact, I was going to read it at the end, but I'll read it now because otherwise we'll come back to it. I'll just read this
Yeah.
real quick. I know we normally don't read things. I remember Doug encouraging us to read passages when we started the show. So tonight, Doug, if you're watching, I'm finally taking your advice. It's only taken a year, but and this is so important. I think I
Mhm.
think this is real. I read this today, and I had read it years ago, and I was like, that's so true. Keith says what is ultimately important about Alternative 3 is not that it sets much of its grim script on the moon or Mars or beneath ice of Arctic, as Leslie Watkins says. These are merely locales that humans currently inhabit or will probably soon be erecting golden arches in. What is important is the explicit pointing to government and ruling class
Yeah.
atrocity and human subjugation and the warning it contains. Alternative 3 is a scenario of the victimization of humankind, which I presume includes you, by power hungry men who have abandoned any consideration of morality or what is right and have replaced it with a mad scientific or philosophic lust for power. If you
Mhm.
haven't gotten the idea that this world is run by a criminal elite lacking the slightest concern for the welfare of mankind, then you haven't been paying attention. And he goes
Yeah.
on to say, isn't that what Alternative 3 is essentially about?
Yeah. No, you're 100% right. Like that's I was listening to a comedian the other day. I say the other day, it's actually probably been a couple months ago. And I don't know if he's well known or not, but anyway, he came out and one of his jokes was he goes, you know, I'm not really a conspiracy theorist, but I believe in some conspiracies. He says, what I find really surprising is when people say they don't believe in any conspiracies. He's like, I get you don't believe in all conspiracy theories or even some conspiracy theories, but you don't believe in any of them? You think the government's just batting 1,000? That seems like a pretty strong stance to take, right? I think the problem is what particularly in the in the later 20th century and now in the early, well, I say early, but we're in 2023, 21st century, you really have to be kind of blind, not just unobservant, you have to be willfully blind to believe that that's not really the case. I mean, it just is. Like, just from casual observation, it's clear that our world is not really run by people who have our best interest in heart.
Yeah, there was a wonderful movement in the 70s of, I mean, things like this, which were fictional, but also
Mhm.
people like Robert Anton Wilson with, the Illuminatus trilogy and
Mhm.
his Cosmic Trigger book, and Neil Wilgis's The Illuminoids, as well as obviously more political groups like the John Birch Society and
Yep.
Gary Allen's None Dare Call It Conspiracy. But there was a culture where people were very suspicious or beginning to become very suspicious, and this probably started really with the assassination of Kennedy through the Vietnam War up to Watergate. But there was a growing suspicion, I think, of
Mhm.
government in the 70s and of the power elites in the 70s, and I think it fell away for a while. I think it's back again today, but I
Yeah.
think today we're very divided in that there's people who feel very difficult not to believe the
Mhm.
nightly news television anchor late show comedian take on political reality. And so anything which doesn't fit that
Mhm.
spectrum is conspiracy theory. But if you think that the corporations who own all of these networks and all of these channels, and for a minute, let's say I don't even think it's a hideous conspiracy like Alternative 3. If you don't
Mhm.
think they have specific messaging and specific agenda, which is coordinated, if you think they just will just let anything go out, that's naivete.
Yeah.
Companies worth billions of dollars don't just say, "We're just gonna let the narrative flow anywhere we want it to."
Hundreds of
Exactly,
billions
and
of dollars.
look at the advertisers on some networks. You don't think that their influence, we
Mhm.
won't even say anything because obviously we're on, certain platforms where we can't, but look at who advertises with news programs. You don't think there's an influence there on what is said about those companies in the news? Their products in the news?
Mhm. And the news itself is a product. I mean, again, certain companies who shall not be named, on the information side, one of the reasons they are as big as they are, in fact, most of these companies are as big as they are, is honestly the DoD and the military industrial complex, like information systems, right? And not just the one that you're thinking of that you use to look up things, all of them, right? All of them, even if you order books from them, even if you play on their pads, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, give away, and your face is on some of their groups. The reason those companies are worth billions upon billions, several of them are now in the trillions of dollars, is because of their information systems. The DoD funded them. The DoD sponsors. They run server farms that they are intimately connected with. So yeah, at a certain point, you have to stop and go, hold up. You mean there really isn't, this sort of division, like, oh, here's, private industry, and then here's the military. It's all actually one big thing. It just legally looks like it's not, but it really is one big thing. Oh, that's a problem. And you kind of have to, at this point of the game, you have to ignore that's a reality. So in the 70s, it would be easier to sort of find this surprising. Today, though, you really can't. And if you don't understand that's what's going on, that's because you have chosen not to see it.
I think there's been a weird, and we don't talk politics on this show, but I do think there's been a weird transformation in the political mindset as well. I think in the 70s, you were probably more likely to read something by Robert Anton Wilson or Neil Wilgus or maybe even Alternative 3 and not be in the traditional conservative side of the political spectrum and really doubt the powers that be. But it seems to me today that the side of the political spectrum which once doubted the corporations and the powers that be and the military industrial complex now literally believe every talking point that comes down the pike. It's very strange. Like something very weird has happened to like when you would think about in the 60s and 70s, like it was all about fighting the man and the hippies and, don't trust the big guy if you were on that side of the political spectrum, if you were cool on that side of the political spectrum. But these days, it doesn't seem to be that way anymore. These days, it seems to be you're paranoid if you don't believe what a late night comedy show tells you about the news. You're paranoid if you don't believe what CNN tells you about the news. So I'm not sure. There was some very clever redirection of people who used to be suspicious by their politics, but now are accepting of corporate agendas. It's weird to me. Like I'm not sure how it was done, but it was masterfully done, and it was done by the same type of people that Jim Keith's warning us about.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, and just to throw that back out there, like it's one of those things you can't unsee when you find out that I'm terrible with names, and tonight is even worse. The Doors. Problem is, I saw Jim Garrison now. Jim Morrison. There we go. Jim Morrison's father. Like I thought this was the most cockeyed. Like this couldn't be real. Like it's one of those things you read on the internet. And you're like, oh, and you're like, oh, that's not real. Jim Morrison's father was the admiral who oversaw the Gulf of Tonkin incident.
Just crazy.
And you're like, I'm sorry. Wait. Stop. You're telling me that the guy who basically becomes the face of the psychedelia movement, his father was the vice admiral overseeing the Gulf of Tonkin incident that got us into Vietnam. And then you start, again, you hear about the CIA's connection to Disney and all of these weird connections about who's related to who. And you're like, okay, stop. This feels weird. Like this is not, these connections should not exist. And yet they do. And it's very easy to kind of start looking at this saying, what's really happening here? Because to your point, I remember doing this in the early 2000s when, again, on the conservative side, people were saying, the conservatives, they're all, government and all this. And I was like, wait. I remember my parents taking me as a child and young teenager in the late 80s, early 90s to these things where they're talking about, hey, if you're pulled over by the police, you make certain they have a warrant to get into your car. Do not let them inspect your car. Like, I remember it's like, hold on. I thought some of us radical conservatives, we were the anti-government people. I thought, why are we suddenly now the government people? Why are we, yay, let's give them power to watch everything? I was like, whoa, what happened here? I remember talking to my father about this. I'm like, what is going on? This isn't what it was about. Like, what happened? Why are we suddenly the big government people all of a sudden? What happened here? And so it's, to your point, it happened on both sides. In fact, it's almost as if it's kind of irrelevant what side you're on. It's just, they'll just swing the pendulum to one other side, and then that side becomes the side that's in power and still do all of the things they want to have happen. And they'll just use those talking points. And then when it's like, okay, we got what we can get out of y'all, we're going to go over to this side and we're going to use this. So, but to bring it back to uh to our point, you know, the video of today and the book, I want to go back to the thing that really lends credence to this whole thing is Horace Smith's point of, in 1943, scientists were, you know, disappeared from public sight because they were going to Los Alamos, right? They never dropped, he points out, they never dropped completely out of contact, right? Because they would mail people, you know, they would send mail back and forth. That is actually a point that's brought up in this documentary.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, the thing about the film, they do, and again, I haven't read the book, but the film does a really good point of saying is, yes, there are attempts to fake communication between loved ones and whatever, but at a certain point they kind of stop and it all sort of falls apart because they clearly aren't where they're supposed to be. They aren't doing what they claimed they were doing. And so it is one of those things where it's like, yeah, again, of the things that would kind of lead you to say this video may, or that they may have actually hit on something, is we have seen this stuff happen before. We have seen scientists whisked away and taken to undisclosed locations in mass before. We have seen that happen. We know the government would do it because they did it before. So it's another one of those things that rings a little too true to be easily dismissed. So I got to ask, since we're at the 55-minute mark, Dean, do you think that they hit on a breakaway civilization thing, that's what they actually hit on, or is there maybe something else that is just close enough?
I think perhaps in some ways both. I mean, perhaps there are, as I've already mentioned, secret underground bases, right? We know that. That's not
Yeah.
even, you know, that's not even open for any debate now. We know things like, you know, atomic weapons were detonated in the atmosphere to see what would happen, you know, and I think there's still a radiation built up there today because of that, actually. But do I think there's a breakaway civilization? I will say this. I think I would have to be foolish to say that there isn't a black budget space program, or rephrase that, a black budget space aeronautical technological program of some sort. There's so much money sunk into the black budget. Interestingly, Jim Keith makes the point in this book as well, similarly to the documentary we did about the underground, that an awful lot of that black budget money goes towards paying for underground bases. Supposedly a lot of that disappears into the underground base hole. So in a way, alternative 2 is true. Is there a breakaway civilization on Moon or Mars? I don't even know. And I don't think Keith is even really concerned with that being a reality. I think the reality is, as an allegory, is the elites will do what the elites want to do. And maybe there is a desire to control the broader population, whether they're planning on fleeing underground or off country or off, you know, or off planet, or whether things like smart cities, which are increasingly popular, the idea that you pack all of the drones into this one little area and you cry environmentally, you know, reasons for why you want to do it, and, you know, convenience, and lots of people out there are happy with the idea of a smart city. I can't think of anything worse. Imagine being somewhere and you're in this area and you never have to go more than 5 miles, and everything's there, but you can't even go probably more than 10 miles unless you're very good and get permission to go, just kind of like your social credit score in China. I think that's the plan. I think that's the technocratic plan, is something like controlling movement, controlling populations. And in some ways that's even scarier than alternative 3, because we can see that creeping towards us. We can see certain United Nations programs with the idea of keeping areas, you know, people free, of limiting it, all these ideas of limiting emissions, all these ideas of enforced austerity, which go back to the Carter, you know, administration in America, and people still like that idea. We've seen that actually implemented in places in Europe to try to get their debt under control. I think there are people who, at the top of the food chain, who very much, whether for good reason or bad, think it would be a great idea to have the hoi polloi masses controlled, contained, and kept in their place, so they can do whatever they want to, and the planet maybe is kept beautiful. Maybe they're really motivated by that idea, but the way they will get there is through a type of alternative 3 dystopia where the little man is kept under control or just disregarded, and the power elites will make the decisions. Now I don't think that's the funny thing is it sounds like conspiracy theory. I just think that's technocratic reality. I just think that's what's happening, is just rolling out, you know. I don't think
It's like
even foolish to think this. Just look at the kind of things that come out of the World Economic Forum. You know, you will own nothing, you know, you will eat bugs and you'll be happy, right? Like that's literally what alternative 3's kind of is kind of a analogous to, you know. It's the same kind of idea. The elites will do what they want to, and you'll either be left behind. It'll be a breakaway civilization, whether it's like a breakaway civilization on Mars or in the Hunger Games. That's the reality. They'll either be people who live very well here, and the rest of us are put in little controlled cities. I'm not saying this is what will happen, but I know this is what they'd like to have happen. So that's my takeaway about the whole breakaway civilization thing. 2 civilizations, absolutely. I think that is what they would love.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I think there's, clearly a space program that is far more advanced than we are allowed to know. But I don't think the breakaway civilization is going to be on Mars or some spaceship and, deep in the in the solar system. It's going to be right here on Earth. And the worst part is we won't even get to fly in one of these. Like I think that's the thing that bothers me the most, is why can't I have my Avro car?
The Jetsons lied.
They did. Well, we'll send his boy Elroy back to bed, and that's it for another Mysterious Library. We will be back next week with another exciting and wonderful episode, and we will see you next time behind the card catalog. Good night, everybody.